السلام عليكم ورحمة الله تعالى وبركاته. بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم. الحمد لله رب العالمين، وصلى الله وسلم وبارك على سيدنا محمد وعلى آله وصحبه وسلم تسليما كثيرا. Welcome to our Dars Kanz al-Daqa'iq, in which we're looking at intermediate Hanafi fiqh by covering one of the classical primers on Hanafi fiqh, Kanz al-Daqa'iq of Imam al-Nasafi rahimahullahu ta'ala. And Omar, it says 2. And by the grace of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, we are going to be beginning the text itself, the book of purification today. But I wanted to just give an opportunity, because a number of people had questions about the class, etc., just to give a couple of minutes so that people can ask their questions, and then we'll begin the class. So would anyone like to ask anything? Bismillah. So we'll give an opportunity if people would like to ask any questions about the class, etc. For those of you who are new, you are welcome to pose, to catch up. One is, please register for the class. That'll give you access to the course forum, etc., with the recommended texts, etc. We'll be sharing the slides, so that'll help you follow along in the class. The class, of course, like all our classes, is completely free, but it gives you access. You can ask your questions there, access previous lessons, the resources, etc. So, any questions, inshallah? And we've kept the class open because a lot of people have been applying, so we wanted to sort of process all the applications at once, so don't worry. Basically, if you've covered Quduri or the like before, Quduri or the Mukhtar, there's 2 criteria. You've studied basic worship, and number 2, you've studied Quduri or the Mukhtar, or a complete text before this, ideally, and there are people we might be able to make exceptions for as well. Any questions? If one were to buy the Kanz al-Daqa'iq, what would be the best edition? Just for the text on its own, the Shaykh Saeed Bakdash edition is good. And there's also Maktabat al-Bushra has an edition with useful footnotes. That doesn't hurt. And we'll be sharing a copy of the old edition in the course forum, inshallah, and we can mention the recommended resources there in the course forum, bi'idhnillahi ta'ala. Go ahead.
Will there be coursework to do during this course?
Yeah, so we're going to have brief review questions for each lesson, just that help students just review the core concepts. They're not there to serve as tests or anything, but just at the end of the class, it reviews the core concepts, inshallah.
Final question,
can we purchase the text in English? So you'll see in the slides, I am translating the text as we go along. So that translation will be available lesson by lesson, inshallah, as part of the course slides. But ideally, one should have, this is sort of getting to intermediate level. You should feel comfortable with the Arabic. Bismillah. Any other questions? Okay. So let's start. Bismillahir Rahmanir Rahim. Alhamdulillahi haqqa hamdih. Alhamdulillah. والصلاة والسلام على سيدنا رسول الله وآله وأصحابه ومن والاه اللهم فقهنا في الدين وعلمنا التأويل وألهمنا رشدنا يا رب العالمين. اللهم علمنا ما ينفعنا وانفعنا بما علمتنا وزدنا من فضلك علما وعملا وإخلاصا يا رب العالمين. Alhamdulillah. In lesson 3 of our lessons on Kanz al-Daqa'iq of Imam Nasafi, after looking at an overview of fiqh and the development of fiqh and the role of the mutun in fiqh, and then looking at Imam Nasafi and his Kanz and what distinguishes it, particularly these 3 key characteristics of precision, depth and nuance. We are now, by the grace of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, beginning with Kitab al-Tahara. قال الإمام حافظ الدين النسفي رحمه الله تعالى ونفعنا به وبكم كتاب الطهارة, the book of purification. So of course, Kitab al-Tahara, if we deem that to be a complete sentence, right? A title, some scholars argue that a title doesn't have i'rab, is not analyzed grammatically, right? So just a title stands on its own. But the other argument, no, it is kalam, and kalam is complete. There's a number of ways you could do the i'rab of it. The most direct is Kitab al-Tahara. Kitab is khabar, and the mubtada is mahdhuf. The implicit is هذا كتاب الطهارة, right? So, and the kitab is mudaf, الطهارة is mudaf ilayhi, right? And you know, we can see that. First thing we're going to look at is just touch briefly on what is purification, and there's some key concepts there. Allah. So the author doesn't define tahara for us, because mutun frequently, one of the things, they give you the issues, but one of the key aspects of knowing a text is you need to be able to define core terms. So if you study a matan, right, you need to know the issues in the matan, but there's key terms. One of the most important of these key terms is tahara, right? Is tahara. And tahara, right, purification, in the Arabic language, tahara, which is with a fatha on the ta, is an-nadhafa. Is an-nadhafa, right? Is cleanliness. And technically, the technical meaning, or you could say legally, in the usage of the fuqaha, right, is an-nadhafa an al-najasa, right? Right? It's to be clean of filth, right? Or nadhafatul mahal an al-najasa, right? Is a cleanliness of the place from najasa. The cleanliness of the place that is, i.e. the place that is pure, from the cleanliness of the place, nadhafatul mahal an al-najasa. If you're following in the Abu Su'ud, Hashit Abu Su'ud, this is page 27. You can see it there. Right? Bottom of the page, Tahara, nadhafatul mahal an al-najasa. The cleanliness of the place from filth. Now, filth is either haqiqiyya, actual filth, right? Actual filth, and this is also called khabath. Khabath, right? Or effective filth, hukmiyya, which is hadath. right? So it's the cleanliness of the place from filth. And then there's actual filth, haqiqiyya, and that's also called khabath, right? Khabath. Right? And khabath yani, refers to al-ayn al-mustaqdara shar'an, right? Al-ayn al-mustaqdara shar'an. It's an essence, it's something that has been legally deemed to be unclean. So it's that which is legally unclean, right? Had that been legally deemed to be unclean. And we'll see what those things are. Right? So this definition is an arbitrated definition, right? Right? So legally, it's cleanliness of the place from filth. Actual, which is najasa hissiyya or najasa haqiqiyya, also called khabath, or effective filth, najasa hukmiyya, which is the hadath, right? So the najasa haqiqiyya, actual filth, also known as khabath, is al-ayn al-mustaqdara shar'an, is any essence that has legally been deemed to be unclean, right? And hadath, right? Hadath, which you can translate as ritual impurity, which is najasa hukmiyya. Hadath is that which requires wudu or ghusl, that which requires wudu, and that's the hadath al-asghar, that's a lesser ritual impurity, or that which requires ghusl, which is al-hadath al-akbar, major ritual impurity, right? Okay. And you can so this definition, right, the commentators differed. That is Tahara Purity, and actually Tahara, by this definition, you'd call it the book of purity, right? There is, right? It's for the place to be pure of filth. Why? Because purity, Tahara, the book of purity, there's an argument amongst the fuqaha, right? This definition was chosen in An-Nahr al-Fa'iq of Umar ibn Nujaym because, and this is an important concept, pay attention. Purity is a condition for prayer. That's why it's important, right? Purity is a condition, and conditions have to be met, they do not have to be sought. Al-ibra في الشروط بحصولها لا بتحصيلها. العبرة في الشروط يعني حصولها is for that they be met, لا تحصيلها, not that they be sought. So purity is for the place to be free of filth, actual or effective. Even if it happened on its own, right? Let's say some sister, name Sister Sa'daniya, right? So there's some auntie, really like the name Sa'diya, but she said, no, I want a different name. So she called her daughter Sa'daniya. So some sister Sa'daniya, she has 6 kids. She had over 8 years, so she's exhausted. She went for a walk in the park. She's really tired. So she found a bench that's hidden, decided to go lie down on the bench, and it rained. And she woke up in the rain. It's a rainstorm. She's wet through. Does she have wudu if her hands, face, head, and feet are all dripping wet? Yes, right? So the place to be clear, to be clean, and let's say she had some blood on her cheeks before, so the blood has been washed away, and she has wudu now, right? So the purity, for the cleanliness of the place, right? So the conditions have to be met, they don't have to be sought. He's objecting here to his older brother and teacher, Zayn ibn Nujaym, who in al-Bahr al-Ra'iq defined it as being the removal of filth, actual or effective. And both definitions have a basis, right? It's زوال حدث أو خبث. إزالة الحدث أو الخبث. The removal of right, of ritual or actual impurity. And there's a back and forth between the other definition, the benefit of the other definition, that it's the removal of ritual or physical impurity. The benefit there is that it's referring to the actions of those morally responsible. Right? And the subject of fiqh is the acts of those morally responsible. So there's a back and forth, but this technically is a superior definition. That was chosen. Don't get lost in Abu Su'ud though, like if you are referring to it, because there's a lot of discussions. If you studied Nur al-Idah, you can see there's two discussions here that I'll point you to, but we won't be covering, that there are conditions for the obligation of ritual purity, and there's conditions for the validity of ritual purity. Right? So shara'it wujub al-tahara, and there's shara'it sihhat al-tahara. And the condition for the validity of tahara is that the entire area that is to be washed, and that there be no preventative from, no preventative that prevents the validity of tahara, right? And we'll be looking at what that is. The legal cause for tahara is the obligation of praying if one is in ritual impurity. Al-qiyamu ila as-salah in kana muhdithan, is needing to pray if one is in ritual impurity, right? We can take the legal definition, right, of ritual purity, right? Yani, right? Right? Is that spiritually purity is the purity is نظافة القلب والأعضاء عن المخالفات والغفلات. Right? It's the purity of the heart and limbs from contraventions of the divine command and from heedlessness. Contraventions of the divine command have to do with sins of the heart and sins of the limbs, and sins are either of commission, engaging in sin, or of omission, failing to do what is obligatory. And the mukhalafa can be fil lazim, and you can break this down logically, right? We don't need to unpack it fully. It's نظافة القلب والأعضاء عن المخالفات والغفلات, and from heedlessness, right? And but that's not the scope of our class. The basis of purification is, and this is an assignment for today, please read and reflect upon, memorize, if you haven't memorized it, the verse of purification, which is from Surah Al-Ma'idah, Quran, the 5th Surah, Al-Ma'idah, verse number 6. That's a little bit of critical background on Tahara. In نظافة المحل عن النجاسة حقيقة الحقيقية أو الحكمية. Okay. That was part 1 on purification. Any questions here before we continue? And the questions in class before the end of the class should be directly on what the topic is, Bismillah. Bismillah, walhamdulillah, wassalatu wassalam. Any questions? Okay. So in part 2 of today's class, we'll look at the obligatory acts of wudu. Fara'idul wudu. So Imam al-Nasafi says, Fardul wudu, the obligation of wudu. Right? Now, Nasafi is very deliberate in his wording, right? Pay attention to how, is there one act of wudu? Right? Many authors say fara'idul wudu, the obligatory acts, but Imam al-Nasafi says, right? Fardul wudu, the obligation of wudu is, right? Insofar as it is one obligatory act, though it's made up of obligatory acts, it is one obligation composed of 4 obligatory elements, but you must do all of this to fulfill the fard. That's why he puts it in the and the fard of wudu is mentioned first because of 3 principal reasons. Even though ghusl is more like ghusl is a more major state, but why would you mention the fard of wudu first? Why would you mention the fard of wudu first before the fard of ghusl?
Because wudu is a part of ghusl.
Because wudu is part of a ghusl, but then you could say washing the feet is part of wudu, so why don't we start with washing the feet? That's correct. That's one aspect. Number 2, it's more commonly needed. Right? you perform wudu multiple times a day. Most people don't need to make ghusl multiple times a day, right? And also because this is what's mentioned first in the Quranic verse, the ayah of Tahara that we referred to, Surah 5 verse 6, and in the teaching of Sayyidina Jibreel alayhi salam to the Prophet sallallahu alayhi wasallam. Okay, Fard al-Wudu, right? So let's read the text first. He says, Fardul wudu, ghaslu wajhihi, washing one's face, right? Ghaslu wajhihi. And the dhamir goes back to the person who's known. It is the morally responsible person, right? So I've taken out that referential, right? Ghaslu wajhihi, ay wajhul mutawaddi, who is ma'hud dhihnan, who is understood. وهو من قصاص شعره, and that is from the beginning of the hairline, إلى أسفل ذقنه, to the bottom of one's chin, وإلى شحمتي الأذن, and from earlobe to earlobe. That's the first. That's washing the face. وَيَدَيْهِ بِمِرْفَقَيْهِ, and washing both hands with their elbows. And you notice here that when it comes to the hands, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, out of great wisdom, says إِلَى الْمَرَافِقِ, to the elbows. And some of the texts put it in that way. But he says بِمِرْفَقَيْهِ, so and there's a wisdom why Allah addresses it in this way, because that's part of the divine wisdom of there being ijtihad, right? And also for the purpose of eloquence in the Quran. It's much more eloquent the way it's put in the Quran, right? And because guidance is meant to inspire and move and bring out wisdom. Legal texts are not meant to be any of that, right? Because a few issues arise in the Quranic verse legally. One is اغسلوا أيديكم, what's it? وأيديكم إلى المرافق, wash your arms to the elbows. So does the elbow enter, etc.? There's a few other issues there as well. The legal understanding from that is بِمِرْفَقَيْهِ, with their elbows, right? The ba of musahaba, murafiqan bi, right? بِمِرْفَقَيْهِ, with their elbows. And he chose the ba for brevity as well. Al-Ta'i in his commentary actually suggests it would be even clearer to say ma'a mirfaqayhi, right? وَرِجْلَيْهِ بِكَعْبَيْهِ, and washing both legs with their ankles. And the same thing was mentioned by Al-Ta'i, بِكَعْبَيْهِ أي مَعَ كَعْبَيْهِ, with their ankles. Again, clarifying the possible outward readings of the Quranic text. And then he says, وَمَسْحُ رُبُعِ رَأْسِهِ, and wiping a quarter of the head. And we'll look at the definition. And then he says, وَلِحْيَتِهِ, and the beard. And we'll come to that in a moment. Right? This dangler at the end, this could be read in a few ways. And you could read it as وَلِحْيَتِهِ, or right? Yeah. You could read it in 3 ways, right? وَلِحْيَتِهِ could be معطوف to, it could be وَمَسْحُ رُبْعِ لِحْيَتِهِ, or it could be مَسْحُ لِحْيَتِهِ, or it could be وَلِحْيَتُهُ, right? And then it could be, the implicit would be, so, and one's beard, meaning, and either a quarter of one's beard, wiping a quarter of one's beard, or wiping one's beard, or and one's beard, and there's something implicit which would be is washed. It can also be. So there's 3 possibilities, and we'll come to that in a second. That's the first of the very obvious Daqa'iq in the text, but there's a few things that have already, the fard being used, that it's one act, right? Now the obligatory acts of wudu, there's a few things that we look at. Firstly, what is the fard? Right? What is the fard? Right? And how is the fard different from the wajib? Right? So this is an important aspect. You should be clear about this already. What is the fard? Now, what is the fard? We can look at the fard in terms of 3 things. Right? The fard we look at in terms of thubutul fard, right? Right? The how the fard is established, what it affirms, and what is its consequence. Right? So the fard is established, right? Al-fard is, and sometimes 1 and 2 are combined together, right? So in terms of thubut, in terms of being affirmed, the fard ما ثبت بدليل قطعي لا شبهة فيه, right? It is established by a decisive text. Right? That's how it's affirmed, right? بدليل قطعي لا شبهة فيه. That's not open for, that we don't that the mujtahid doesn't deem it open for multiple interpretations, right? And it expresses a command. It expresses a command. That's the right? So that's number 1 into the thubut, and what it affirms a command, right? Which is to do something, ala sabi, it affirms having to do something unequivocally. Because something can be decisively established, like siwak is decisively established. But what is established decisively? The encouragement to brush your teeth. There's no obligation to brush your teeth. Intrinsically, siwak per se is not obligatory. So it's established by a decisive text, and it affirms the duty to do something, right? Right? To do something, such that you need to do something unequivocally such that you are not allowed to leave it. And it's general, of course. Exceptions are something else, right? So it affirms, is decisively established. The fard is established by a command, right? Which is that it's talabul fi'l hatman. It's that you are told to do something unequivocally, such that you cannot leave it. Right? So the amr, that the command, when it's decisively established, the unequivocal call to do something such that you cannot not do it, if it's decisively established, it would affirm the fard. And then the third part is the consequence, that the consequence of the fard is that if it's left, it is sinful, and if that fard is part of an action, the action commanded would not be valid without it. So these are the three considerations of the fard. A text is decisive based on two considerations: thubut and dilala. How the text is established and what the text indicates. So the fard is established by a text that is qat'iyyu thubut, qat'iyyu dilala. The fard, the obligation in the Hanafi school, is established by a text that's decisive in its affirmation, decisive in its indication. Qat'iyyu thubut, decisive in its establishment, is all of the Quran and that which is actually or effectively mutawatir of the Sunnah. Actually or effectively mutawatir of the Sunnah. Then the dilala, the indication that the text affirms its meaning qat'an, decisively, rather than dhannan, then probabilistically, non-decisively. Right? So if it's qat'i thubut, qat'i dilala, decisive in its establishment, decisive in its indication, it's fard. If the command is affirmed through a text that either in its establishment or its indication is non-decisive, so it affirms the meaning clearly but not quite decisively, it would affirm the wajib. Right? Such as reciting the Fatiha, for example, etc. So that's the fard. Right? The wajib is established by a non-decisive, is a command established by a non-decisive text that indicates that the requirement to do something such that if you leave it, it is sinful, but less than the sin of leaving the fard, and the consequence of leaving the wajib is that the action would be deficient. And we'll see more about that when we come to the wajib in the prayer. And if you're not intimately familiar with that, review your notes from Nur al-Idah, etc. Why 4? Because these are the 4 obligations that are affirmed in the verse of purification. Because the indication, the verse makes it a condition. If you stand to pray, and what's implicit is, and you're not in ritual purity, do this. 4 actions are mentioned, but do this. It's as if this is the obligation. This is why Imam al-Nasafi refers to as fardul wudu. That Allah has commanded us, there's one command. فَاغْسِلُوا وُجُوهَكُمْ وَأَيْدِيَكُمْ إِلَى الْمَرَافِقِ وَامْسَحُوا بِرُؤُوسِكُمْ وَأَرْجُلَكُمْ إِلَى الْكَعْبَيْنِ. This is This is one command that has 4 components, right? Then do this. 4 things are mentioned. The implication of that is that if you do this, now you can pray. So nothing else is fard. And everything else that whose requirement is understood is established by a text that is non-decisive. It's either established through the Sunnah, that is not mutawatir, or it's open to interpretation. Right? So someone could say, but Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, so that you say, what about the ayah of intention? The hadith of intention? The hadith of intention is non-decisive in its indication, in its establishment. It's not a mutawatir hadith. It's actually not even a mashhur hadith. It's ahad. إِنَّمَا الْأَعْمَالُ بِالنِّيَّاتِ. It's a sahih hadith, yes. But in terms of strength of it, and it's also non-decisive in its indication. It's non-decisive in its indication. إِنَّمَا الْأَعْمَالُ صَحِيحَةٌ بِالنِّيَّةِ or كَامِلَةٌ بِالنِّيَّةِ. But then another question arises, then, well, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala commands, وَمَا أُمِرُوا إِلَّا لِيَعْبُدُوا اللَّهِ مُخْلِصِينَ لَهُ الدِّينَ. They've only been commanded that they worship Allah, making their religion sincere unto Him. How would we answer that? Wudu is an act of worship. Allah says, your command is only that you do A and B. So if you don't have intention, how could you be sincere? How do you answer that, folks? Anyone? You can type your answer or you can say it as well. Bismillah. And those of you who are following the recording, pause for a second and think about it. Someone said, why isn't intention required? You say, okay, the hadith is non-decisive. Of course, part of the difference with the Sada Shafi'iyya radiallahu anhum is they say, no, what's established with the Sunnah affirms the like of what's established by the Quran. We said yes, but at their levels of affirmation and indication. And that's an usuli argument. And we're not ready to get into munazara, and this is not the time and age for debate, but to understand ourselves. Because purification is a means. The ibadah, there's a ibadah maqsuda. What is the ibadah maqsuda? Prayer, fasting, charity, zakat, hajj, reciting Quran, dhikr, dua. These are ibadat maqsuda. Tahara, as the Prophet ﷺ said, miftahuha. Right? What's the hadith? مفتاحها الوضوء, right? أو الطهارة كما قال صلى الله عليه وسلم. It's key, right? It's a means, right? And it's a condition. الطهور شطر الإيمان. Purity is the first half of faith. Right? One of the interpretations, faith here refers to prayer. It's the first half is the conditions, and then the rest of it is the actions themselves. So it's a means and a condition. وَالْعِبْرَةِ فِي الشُّرُوطِ. And what counts in conditions, حُصُولُهَا, that they be met, not that they be sought. Just as you don't have to intend that my nakedness is covered, the condition is fulfilled. Right? So Sister Sa'daniya, if she woke up in the rainstorm, she doesn't have to intend, I'm intending wudu in this rainstorm. You got fully drenched and decisively. You'll be cautious just to rub, just to make sure everything, but you are so drenched, you got wudu. Khalas. You could go and pray. It's best not to pray in mud though, because getting one's face unnecessarily dirty is undignified, or one's clothes. Okay. There's two other concepts. What is ghusl and what is ghusl, what is washing, and what is masah, wiping, right? So ghusl is إسالة الماء مع التقاطر, is for water to flow, is to make water flow over the area with dripping. With dripping. Such that unless you left it and just kept rubbing so that no dripping could actually happen, right? But that there would be dripping. That's what's called ghusl. But using excessively little water is makruh. Right? At-taqtir, using excessively little water is disliked. Right? Just as israf is disliked, just as wastefulness is disliked. Wiping is defined as isabatul ma' al-udu, is for water to reach the limb. Right? Because what's mash, right? In Arabic, mash is a masdar. Right? Masaha yamsahu mashan. The masdar can indicate doing the action or the result of the action. Right? So it's not the act of wiping that is sought, but the result of the wiping, which is for wetness to reach the limb. Right? Right? So Sister Sa'daniya is a curious individual. She realized that she splashes water so much when making wudu. She stopped splashing the water, but she missed the experience. So what she did, she took some water and just splashed the mirror. Then she said, you know what? I learned in the Kanz that I could just rub my head against the mirror. If you get a quarter of your head wet in that way, your head is wiped. But of course, there's a sunnah way to do things. So for example, if you're walking in the rain and more than a quarter of your head got wet, you got wudu. Your head has been wiped. Because what's meant by the mash, and this is المصدر قد يدل على إيقاع الفعل أو الحاصل من الفعل. Right? Same with ghusl. Is the act of washing or the result of washing, which is for water to have flowed over the limbs with dripping. Okay, Bismillah. So there are 4 acts, and you should be familiar with the details of these. We're just going to touch on some key components of these. If this is the first time you're covering this, we would recommend you take the level 1 classes on worship, absolute essentials, ascent to felicity, and the level 2 classes like Quduri or Mukhtar before this. We also have a class on Nur al-Idah, which is in quite a bit of detail, Maraq al-Falah, if you're able. Right? So he says, غسل وجهه وهو من قصاص شعره, washing the face, which is from the beginning of the top of the hairline, and you can say qusas. This is muthallath. You can say qusas or qisas or qasas, but the more common may well be qusas with a dhamm. Right? 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 Some of the ulama, just for washing, they didn't like adding taqatur because that's just a descriptor. That's just a descriptor for washing. Right? That they say isalatul ma. Because the ma' taqatur, technically, the water doesn't flow unless it drips. Right? Because the skin does not absorb all the water, so the dripping is inevitable. But they mention that for the purpose of clarity. And that's discussed in Fathullah al-Mu'in. Now, qusas al-sha'r is the beginning of the hairline, right? And this is a ta'rif bil-ghalib. This is defining something by the general case, as At-Ta'i mentions in his commentary, right? A more formal definition is min mabda'i sath al-jabha, from the beginning of, past the beginning of the top of the forehead. Okay? It begins from the beginning of min mabda'i sath al-jabha, from the roof of the forehead, okay? Past the forehead, right? Right? But the definition would be that this is jariyun ala al-ghalib. This is following what's the general case, right? Right? To the bottom of one's chin. The chin, the dhaqan, right, begins, is where your two jawbones meet, right? So what we entail by this, right, and from earlobe to earlobe, right, to earlobe to earlobes. So there's a number of things that you need to, so anything within this area you need to wash. That includes the, between your between your eye and your nose, right, etc. The whole area, right? And you can see and likewise between the idhar, between your sideburns and your ears. Sometimes people are negligent of that, right? And those are areas that, if you look in the Tanweer, for example, he mentioned, like, pay attention to the between your ear, between your eye and your nose, between your sideburns and your ears, right? And any hair on your face, if it's thin, you have to wash the skin. If it's thick, you need, like eyebrows, for example, etc. If it's thin, you need to wash the skin. But if you flow the water, you assume it's washed. And if it's thick, then you just have to wash the outer part of it. And we'll see that under when he discusses the beard. Okay, washing both hands with their elbows, right? Washing both hands with their elbows, right? That's very straightforward, inshallah, right? One needs to make sure there's no preventative on them, and amongst the preventatives is nail polish, for example. The command is that one wash both hands. So the fact that if someone's wearing some kind of nail polish, that the water gets through, is that washing though? Is that washing? And does water flow over the actual nails? No. Likely not, right? So as opposed to something like henna or a non-barrier coloring, right? In which case it's not a perceptible barrier, then so stains are not considered to prevent water from reaching the skin. But if you have paint and the like, it prevents. So you need to be careful about that. Number 3, washing both legs, meaning both feet, with their ankles. It should say washing both feet with their ankles. With their ankles, meaning up to and including their ankles. And the way this is expressed in the Quranic verse points to being careful about not wasting water, right, in wudu, right, as Imam Zamakhshari is quoted as having described. Right? So elbows and ankles must be washed fully. Right? And then he says, wiping a quarter of the head. So the head begins from the top of from past the top of the forehead, right? Any part of the head is sufficient. The head ends, as is mentioned in the Dur, فوق الأذنين, above the ears. Right? And wiping is إصابة الماء العضوة, right? It's for water to reach the limb. And some said إصابة البلة العضوة, for the wetness to reach the limb, just to differentiate. And then he says this very intriguing thing, and one's beard. What? So there are three opinions about the beard. Right? Wiping the beard, or wiping the beard, or wiping a quarter of the beard, or washing the beard. Right? Right? And so Imam, and these are all positions within the madhab, right? 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 The strongest position, right, is, and you can quote it if you would like from Maraq al-Falah, right? So the weakest position is wiping a quarter of the beard, but this may well be on the assumption that someone has a full beard, right? But that's the weaker of the three opinions. Wiping the beard, wiping the outer beard is stronger, but the relied upon position in the madhab is washing the beard, and what's meant by the beard is ما كان من دائرة الوجه, right? Within the circumference of the face, right? So washing the beard within the circumference of the face is obligatory, right? It's sufficient to make water flow over the outer skin. If the beard is thick, you must get water to the skin if the beard is thin. A thin beard or thin facial hair is that which you can see the skin under it from بالمقابلة المعتادة, from a normal facing. Any hair that is beyond the limits of the face is not wajib to wash, but it is sunnah to wipe. بل يسن المسح. So the beard, the relied upon position is washing the beard within the limits of the face. And others said wiping the beard within the limits of the face. And that's a validated opinion. You can see, for example, it's mentioned in the Tanweer and other. So the thick beard, washing the outer beard. Thin beard, one must get water to the skin underneath. What is beyond the limits of the face, it's sunnah to wipe it with a wetted hand. Why a quarter of the head? And why a quarter of the head? This is pointed to, and our focus is not on the legal reason, but just to point to, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala says it in the verse, وَامْسَحُوا بِرُؤُوسِكُمْ. Surah Al-Ma'idah verse 6, وَامْسَحُوا بِرُؤُوسِكُمْ. Literally wipe with your heads. Now, there are two lines of reasoning why we affirm a quarter of the head. One line of reasoning is that the Quranic verse could be understood in multiple ways, So how much of the head you wipe is mujmal, is non-detailed, and the Sunnah makes tafsir of it. The Sunnah details it, and the least that is affirmed in the Sunnah is the extent of the front of the head, which is a quarter. Like the hadith of al-Mughira ibn Shu'bah, that the Nabi sallallahu alaihi wasallam masaha ala nasiyatihi. The Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam wiped over, wiped the front of his head. You have 4 parts of the head: front, back, side, and side. So that's one line of reasoning. That's simplified reasoning. But the usuli perspective in the Hanafi school would be, no, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala says, وَامْسَحُوا بِرُؤُوسِكُمْ الْأَصْلُ فِي الْبَاءِ أَن تَدْخُلَ عَلَى الْآلَةِ. Right? That wiping requires an instrument. And we say wipe with, but it says literally, وَامْسَحُوا بِرُؤُوسِكُمْ. Literally it's as if wipe with your heads. So if the head, and this is a rhetorical tool, if the head is being made آلة المسح, if the head is being made the tool of wiping, what are you wiping with your head? What are you wiping with your head? وَامْسَحُوا بِرُؤُسِكُمْ. Wipe with your heads. What is being wiped then? As it were. Anyone?
The hand.
The hand. وَامْسَحُوا بِرُؤُوسِكُمْ أَيْدِيَكُمْ. Wipe with your heads your hands. As if you put your hand, you move your head a little bit, and if you and the what is masah? Right? The lexical meaning of masah is imrarul yad ala shay. Is wiping in its lexical meaning is to pass your hand over something. The least that would be considered wiping is if you move the hand slightly. Just try it right now. Put your hand on top of your head. Move your hand slightly. The least that would be considered wiping would be a quarter. Right? So what's understood? وَامْسَحُوا بِرُؤُوسِكُمْ. And of course this is for rhetorical eloquence and conciseness. Wipe with your heads. What is being wiped? The only thing. Wipe with your heads. What? Wipe. I'm forgetting Sister Sa'daniya who wiped the mirror with her head. The normal thing would be to wipe the hand with the head, right? So as if it's saying wipe with your hands a quarter of the head, right? And that's the reasoning, and this is just a very simplified line of reasoning. There's a lot more to it, right? So these are the fard actions of wudu, right? Then he says, the next part we look at was sunanuhu, right? The sunnahs of wudu. Right? And he lists a number of sunnahs, right? وَسُنَنُهُ إِلَى آخِرِهِ, right? There's a couple of things to look at here. Firstly, he says وَسُنَنُهُ. Sunan is plural of sunnah, right? Is a plural of sunnah. In the Arabic language, sunnah refers to al-tariqatul masluka, right? Or just al-tariqa, right? Sunnah is a way that it's a way. And to be brief, a sunnah is a tariqa, is a way. Some put a tariqa al-masluka, a way that is followed, but it's only a way if it's followed, right? So that's really ziyadat al-idah, right? A way that is followed. That's in the Arabic language, right? Now, there's a general religious meaning of the sunnah, right? Right? The sunnah in the Arabic language is al-tariqah. Right? And it's used in that sense in the hadith of the Prophet, actually in the Quran and the sunnah. Sunnat al-awwaleen, the way of those before you. Right? And it's been used both in a positive sense and a negative sense. The Prophet ﷺ said, you will follow sunan al-ladina min qablikum. You follow the ways of those who came before you. Arm's length by arm's length, hand span by hand span. So much so that if one of them were to go into a hole, you would follow them into it. And the Prophet ﷺ cautioned. And if there were those of the other peoples who were to engage in intercourse publicly, even with their own family member, some of my ummah will do it too. Why? Just because of following of others. And so sunnah can be used in a negative sense. وَلِعَاذُ بِاللَّهِ. May Allah protect us and the ummah of Rasulullah sallallahu alayhi wa sallam. مَنْ سَنَّ سُنَّةً حَسَنَةً فَلَهُ أَجْرُهَا وَأَجْرُ مَنْ عَمِلَ بِهَا. Whoever inaugurates a good way that is followed has its reward and the reward of those who act upon it, without it diminishing their reward in any way. وَمَنْ سَنَّ سُنَّةً سَيِّئَةً. And whoever inaugurates a bad habit, فَلَهُ وِزْرُهَا. They have its sin. وَوِزْرُ مَنْ عَمِلَ بِهَا. And the sin of those who act upon it. Right? So sunnah is used in a way that is followed. The religious sense of sunnah is tariqatul Nabi sallallahu alayhi wa sallam, the way of the Prophet sallallahu alayhi wa sallam. And it has a range of usages. Has a range of usages. Right? Right? But legally, right? Legally, the sunnah can be divided into the emphasized sunnah and the recommended sunnah. Right? So the emphasized sunnah as mentioned by Ibn Abdin, quoting al-Bahr al-Ra'iq, that مَا وَاظَبَ عَلَيْهِ النَّبِيُّ صَلَّى اللَّهُ عَلَيْهِ وَسَلَّمَ is that which was done consistently by the Messenger of Allah sallallahu alayhi wasallam. Without leaving except rarely. If it's something the Prophet ﷺ did regularly but left, sometimes it is the recommended sunnah. Right? And this is important to keep in mind with other definitions. That the recommended is what the Prophet ﷺ did once or twice, meaning he did once and left once, did twice, left once. Because it's a way, as sunnah indicates, that which someone does consistently. So instead did once, meaning did once, left once, or did twice, left once. Right? Right? So the sunnah is that which مَا وَاظَبَ عَلَيْهِ النَّبِي صَلَّى اللَّهُ عَلَيْهِ وَسَلَّمَ. This is what the Prophet ﷺ did consistently. If it's without leaving, except if there's an excuse, it is the emphasized sunnah. وَإِنْ كَانَتْ مَعَ التَّرْكِ أَحْيَانًا فَهِيَ غَيْرُ الْمُؤَكَّدَةِ. If it's with leaving on occasion, this is the non-emphasized sunnah. Right? And there's a third thing, وَإِنْ اقْتَرَنَتْ بِالْإِنْكَارِ عَلَى مَنْ لَمْ يَفْعَلْهُ فَهِيَ الْوَاجِبِ. And if it's something the Prophet ﷺ did regularly, and it's connected with censuring the one who did not do it, it could be the wajib. That's the emphasized sunnah. The recommended sunnah is what the Prophet ﷺ did regularly, but not invariably. Right? And there's more details to it than that, but just in a simplified way. The ruling of the emphasized sunnah is مَا يُؤْجَرُ عَلَى فِعْلِهِ. You're rewarded for doing it. وَيُلَامُ عَلَى تَرْكِهِ. Secondly, it's blameworthy to leave. Right? وَإِنْ اعْتَادَ تَرْكَهُ قَدْ يَأْثَمْ. Right? You're rewarded for doing it. It's blameworthy to leave the emphasized sunnah. And if left consistently without excuse, it would be considered, left consistently without excuse, it would be considered potentially sinful. I would highly encourage you to take notes. I just, today's class is fully based on way back in Damascus. I started, can you just zoom in a little bit? It's kind of embarrassing. So I put together my own notes on the text, and I used a key for the main sources, right? It's a bit embarrassing. I have a friend who made a stamp for me. That's just a curiosity. I think I've lost the stamp now. Anyways, right? And it's good to take notes, right? So, but don't, what the Mashaykh recommended was, like, when you take notes, right? Leave generous margins, right? Just write the text in no more than a third or so of the page, space it out logically, and leave a lot of space. Keep one page blank so you can take notes later, right? So I wrote out the text and then break down each of the sunnahs, right? And leave generous margins. Leave the space here because sometimes you may have other things to add later, right? So on some pages, I found other useful things, so you added them from elsewhere, right? You don't pay, you use some more paper, but it's there for a purpose. Okay, so that's the emphasized sunnah. Has three characteristics. The three rulings of consequence. You're rewarded for doing it. Is blameworthy to leave it. If you make it a habit to leave, it may be sinful. If you habit to leave without excuse. The recommended sunnah, you're rewarded for doing it, and it's not blameworthy to leave. Leaving some recommended sunnahs could be somewhat disliked. There's also a notion of the sunan ad-din. There's this central sunnahs of our religion that relate to this is what the religion came for. These are called sunan al-huda. And then there's supplementary sunnahs, which are things that you're leaving the sunnahs of religion, the core sunnahs, praying in congregation, giving the adhan, right? Doing the sunnahs of wudu, observing the sunnahs of prayer, etc. They're core sunnahs of religion, and they're supplementary sunnahs. These are called sunan al-zawaid. These are recommended to do. Yeah, but it's becoming the believer. And then there's sunnahs of habit. These relate to the worldly habits of the Prophet ﷺ. There's a general recommendation to follow the Prophet ﷺ in them, but that's not the purpose of the religion. If you become religious and you decide, what do I need to do? I'm going to start applying kuhl to my eyes. I'm going to grow my hair long. I'm going to sit on the ground, eat with my hand. I'm going to wear an izar. I'm going to walk in a sandal. I'm going to have coarse grains, not refined grains. Are you rewarded for that? Are you rewarded for that?
Yes.
Yes, you are, if you intended to follow the Prophet ﷺ. But these are sunan. This is not directly what the Prophet ﷺ came with. He came to give us those actions that enable us either to submit to the command of Allah, or that enable us to turn to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. These are the sunan ad-din. That's the maqsood. It was the maqsoodul anbiya, right? Is da'watul khalq ila lil khaliq. Is to call creation to the Creator. How? To recognize Him, to submit to Him, to worship Him, to seek Him, right? So these are secondary sunnahs. They are rewarded for the meaning of following the Prophet ﷺ. But one prioritizes the emphasized sunnahs and the intrinsically recommended sunnahs. But the sunnahs of habits, what you can take on of the habits of the sunnah, these are praiseworthy matters. But they are not the focal point, and there should never be in detriment to what is more of a priority. Okay. The sunnahs of wudu, you should be familiar with these. So he says, وَسُنَنُهُ غَسْلُ يَدَيْهِ إِلَى رُسْغَيْهِ ابْتِدَاءً, is to wash both hands up to the wrists in the beginning of wudu. Right? Washing both hands 3 times. Like he mentions the 3 times once. Right? It's one encompassing sunnah. But washing both hands in the beginning 3 times. And one does so 3 times as mentioned by al-Daqa'iq. Now some copies say كالتسمية. Right? وَسُنَنُهُ غَسْلُ يَدَيْهِ إِلَى رُسْغَيْهِ ابْتِدَاءً كَالتَّسْمِيَةِ, and beginning in the name of Allah, right? كَالتَّسْمِيَةِ. And we could look at if that is which one is stronger in terms of transmission. Ustaz Saeed Bagdash says, what tasmiyah? Now, the tasmiyah, beginning in the name of Allah, وَتَحْصُلُ بِكُلِّ ذِكْر, it is fulfilled by any act of remembrance. Any dhikr fulfills this in terms of the basic sunnah. Right? The transmitted wording is to say Bismillah al-Azim walhamdulillahi ala deen al-Islam. Right? This is related from the Salaf. Bismillah al-Azim walhamdulillahi ala deen al-Islam. In the name of Allah the Tremendous, and all praise is due to Allah for the religion of Islam. Right? And this is, this wording, Bismillah al-Azim walhamdulillahi ala deen al-Islam, is related from the early Muslims. Others, Ibn Abdin says, وَقِيلَ الْأَفْضَلِ بِسْمِ اللَّهِ الرَّحْمَنِ الرَّحِيمِ. Right? And some others said no. If you say Basmala, the basis is you say at-tasmiyah, in the name of Allah, the most complete is say Bismillahir Rahmanir Rahim. Right? Others said that it's good to add the ta'awudh, to say A'udhu billahi minash shaitanir rajim before. Right? Right? So, and it helps to gather one's intention, and we'll look at intention in a bit. But, so if you want to be beginning in the name of Allah, any dhikr, someone says Allahu Akbar and they wash their hands, they fulfill it. Right? Say Hasbunallah wa ni'mal wakeel. Right? Or they say any, or you say any other dhikr, fulfills the sunnah. But a lot of the early Muslims are related to have said Bismillah al-Azim walhamdulillah ala deen al-Islam, or better to say Bismillahir Rahmanir Rahim. Some scholars said to say it after the ta'awudh, after saying A'udhu billahi minash shaitanir rajim. Right? Especially if someone has waswasa, it may be good. A'udhu billahi minash shaitanir rajim, Bismillahir Rahmanir Rahim. If you want to add more than that and say A'udhu billahi minash shaitanir rajim, Bismillahir Rahmanir Rahim, Bismillahil Azim, in the name of Allah the Tremendous, walhamdulillah ala deen al-Islam, and all praise is due to Allah for the religion of Islam. Right? And that's mentioned. Ibn Abdin mentions, وَفِي الْمُجْتَبَى يَجْمَعُ بَيْنَهُمَا. Right? One gathers between them. Right? Now, if you forget saying Bismillah in the beginning, and you remember it during the wudu, you will not fulfill the sunnah. Because wudu is one act. Wudu is one act, as opposed to eating, because every bite is a new act of eating. But the wudu has a beginning. Right? Now, until the face, there's some time, because technically that's the first fard act, but you missed it from the beginning. But one does it, but one fulfill the recommendation. So one should feel regret. Was-siwak, right? And performing the siwak, and siwak refers to the action. Siwak can refer to the instrument or its use. And fiqh looks at the actions, right? Because the instrument is not sought in itself. So was siwak, right? Right? And you can say was siwak, you say kat-tasmiyati was siwaki, beginning, or as-siwaku, right? Now, brushing one's teeth, there's no decisive time that's established about brushing one's teeth. So some said you do it at the beginning of wudu. So you begin, Bismillah ar-Rahman washing and then you brush your teeth first. And that's the opinion of some of the scholars. Al-Haskafi in the Dur chooses عند المضمضة, when you are rinsing your mouth. Right? And the siwak is al-istiyak, is to brush one's teeth. Right? 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 Because siwak, and Maulana Abu Saud in his Hashiyah on the Sharh al-Kanz mentioned siwak refers to the tree from which one uses the instrument, but it also has the meaning of the masdar, right? The verbal noun, which is al-istiyak, the brushing, and that's what is meant here, right? So you don't have to say using the siwak, because the instrument is not sought in itself. The instrument itself is superior, right? And there are details. If one doesn't have a toothstick with one, then one should use one's finger and thumb, or something coarse, like a garment or towel. But you can't do it with someone else's towel, because most people would not give permission for guests to brush their teeth with their towel, right? Then they go use the towel, and they've got your gunk on their towel, right? The siwak is an emphasized sunnah in wudu. Don't neglect that, right? Brushing one's teeth. It is a general, so it's emphasized sunnah for wudu in our madhab. Any prayer that one performs with the wudu in which one brush one's teeth, you have the added reward that is promised in the hadiths on siwak. And the Prophet ﷺ said, "As-siwaku matharatun lil-fam, mardatun lil-rabb." Siwak purifies one's mouth and pleases one's Lord. And so it's an emphasized sunnah in wudu. So one should keep in mind how one brush one's teeth if one's out and about. And that's why having a toothstick is particularly recommended. It's recommended anytime one's breath changes, or after eating, or before prayer, before entering the house, before meeting people, before reciting Quran, before engaging in reading of hadith of the Prophet ﷺ, or before beginning study of ilm, right? And some made ta'meem, before anything important, and before anything important, right? 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 So, and that many Hanafis ignore that. They'll make wudu. There's two elements of negligence. One is failing to brush one's teeth during one's wudu, is leaving an emphasized sunnah. So that's negligence. But there's also a falling short, which is, it is recommended in our madhab to brush one's teeth before prayer. It's recommended anytime one's breath changes, before meeting people, before reciting Quran, before reading hadith, before ilm. Right? That's why Imam Abu Hanifa said, إِنَّهُ مِن سُنَنِ الدِّينِ. It's from the general sunnahs of our religion. And now there's amazing research about how much oral health contributes to the overall health of one's inner systems. And it's almost mind-blowing. And we'll share, just as an aside, it's not a course resource, but we'll put it on the course forum, inshallah. It's an article about, compiled by Shaykh Nuh Keller about, it's not a religious topic per se, but it gives an insight on worldly health, about the role of oral hygiene it appears to affect all fundamental health in profound ways. And that's why the Prophet said, مَطْهَرَةٌ لِلْفَمِ. It's a mathara is a complete purifying of the mouth. It's amazing. Sallallahu ala sahib al-Quran. Sayyidina Muhammad sallallahu alayhi wa sallam. Okay. And then washing, وَغَسْلُ فَمِهِ وَأَنْفِهِ. And washing one's mouth and washing one's nose. Right? The washing one's mouth 3 times and washing one's nose 3 times. Right? So washing one's mouth 3 times, the expression in most of the text is al-madmadatu wal-istinshaq. But madmada requires explanation. And madmada is from the words in Arabic that conveys the sound. Because when you rinse, swish water around your mouth, it's when you make the mad sound. Mad. Right? But غسل فمه, washing the mouth. And the idafa indicates what? Ta'meem. You wash the whole mouth. Right? It's غسل الفم. Right? You ascribe ghasl to the mouth. Right? So meaning washing one's mouth completely. Because that's the sunnah. 3 times. وَأَنْفِهِ أي وَغَسْلُ أَنْفِهِ, washing one's nose 3 times. Optimally with 3 sets of water and washing completely each time. The mouth ends at the back of the throat. The nose, that's emphasized sunnah to wash, is malana min al-anf, the soft part of the nose. Right? Imam Tahtawi mentioned that these are 2 sunnahs that contain within them 7 sunnahs. Right? Which are at-tartib, doing it in order. Mouth 3 times, then nose 3 times. Wat-tathlith, doing each 3 times. Wat-tajdeed, taking different sets of water. وَفِعْلُهُمَا بِالْيَمِينِ, doing them with the right hand. وَالْمُبَالَغَةُ فِيهِمَا, and to exaggerate in these. لِغَيْرِ الصَّائِمِ, for other than the one fasting. That's mentioned in the Tanweer. وَالْمَجْ, and to cast out the water. Right? Because it's being used for purification. So you don't rinse your mouth and say, why waste the water? Let me swallow. No. Sunnah is that you cast out the water. وَالْإِسْتِنْثَارِ, and to let out the water. So this washing one's mouth and nose. Of course, the emphasized sunnah is to wash the mouth fully 3 times. Using the right hand, the order, these are recommended sunnahs, right? So there's 7 recommendations related to these. Okay, then he says, وَتَخْلِيلُ لِحْيَتِهِ وَأَصَابِعِهِ. Right? And to interlace one's beard and one's fingers. And this, to interlace, تَخْلِيلُ لِحْيَتِهِ, this is after washing one's face 3 times. So after washing one's face 3 times, and this is بِأَخْذِ مَاءٍ بِكَفِّ مَاءٍ مِنْ أَسْفَلِهَا, with a handful of water from underneath. Right? And one keeps, and the Dur mentions, وَيَجْعَلُ ظَهْرَ كَفِّهِ إِلَى عُنُقِهِ. One puts the outward hand, points towards. Right? Now, does one take a handful? And this idafa can indicate بِكَفِّ مَاءٍ, with a handful of water, or with a wetted hand. And that's, Shaykh Hadib said he felt that it means a wetted hand. Wallahu a'lam. وَأَصَابِعِهِ, and to interlace one's fingers, and this is, interlace the fingers are, asabi' in Arabic refers to the fingers of one's hands and also the fingers of one's feet, one's toes, أي أصابع يديه ورجليه, as mentioned by Ta'i. In the hands, in the Dur of Imam al-Haskafi, it mentions بالتشبيك, by interlacing, and the feet is by inserting a finger between them. Right? And interlacing anyway fulfills it. What the Dur suggests, what Imam al-Haskafi suggests, that one would use a little finger of the left hand. But that's just in terms of, it's an adab, right? Because it's cleanliness. There's leeway in that. Washing 3 times is tathlithul ghasl, right? Washing 3 times. Here, actually, the best summation of the definition of this is given, arguably, by al-Maydani in al-Lubab. Others have expressed the same thing, but he expressed it in a really nice way. So he says, tathlithul ghasl, washing 3 times. He says, al-mustaw'ib fil a'da'i al-maghsula. Washing, washing 3 times, right? That washing 3 times, such that one washes the limb that is washed completely each time. And if one does not wash completely each time, one will not be doing the sunnah of washing 3 times. And one washes 3 times because because wiping with fresh water, repeating wiping with fresh water is makruh. And you can see it in the Lubab if you have it, right? وَنِيَّتُهُ, and its intention. It's one of those intriguing things that why is the intention of wudu mentioned late? And this, you also see that in Quduri. One argument being that it might be because these are matters where we have difference with some of the other schools. Even though the place of the intention is at the beginning, right? But be as it is, right? So one intends an act of worship, that is only valid with tahara, so intends the prayer or to touch the Quran, right? Or one intends purity, or to intend to lift ritual impurity. One intends wudu, right? Or one intends to obey the divine command. The time of the intention, the intending wudu, is at the beginning of the wudu, fi ibtida' al-wudu, right? In the Arabic language, intention is the resolve to do something. Azmul qalb ala shay is the resolve to do something. There is a beautiful definition of intention that is given by Maulana, and may Allah forgive the person who put this together. Actually, yeah, may He forgive them, but anyways, but yeah, I referenced it, which is not too bad, because so the intention, right, in the Arabic language is the heart's resolve to do something. I used to say, I intend to go on Hajj next year. Is that a legal intention? No, that's the intention generally, the resolve to do something. That's a general sense of intention. But the formal definition of intention is قصد الطاعة والتقرب إلى الله في إيجاب الفعل. It's to resolve to do an act of obedience and to draw closer to Allah when initiating the action. Right? The resolve, قصد الطاعة, the resolve to do an act of obedience. وَالتَّقَرُّبِ إِلَى اللَّهِ, and to draw closer to Allah when initiating the action. This is Ibn Abdin quoting Sa'ad al-Din al-Taftazani from his Talweeh. The resolve to do an act of obedience and to draw closer to Allah at the beginning of the action. What am I doing? Why am I doing it? Right? And one should do that in every action. What am I doing? And this is purposeful action. You should always ask yourself, what am I doing? And even you sit to relax. What am I doing? I'm relaxing. Lillahi Rabbil Alameen. Right? And make good intentions while you're relaxing. Gratitude. To give my body its due. Right? Think of good intentions. Sometimes you realize, what am I doing? Let me do something better. Right? Uttering the intention is recommended for someone who cannot gather their intention otherwise. So it's not intrinsically recommended to utter the intention, but if it helps you gather your resolve, it's praiseworthy. Ibn Abdin quoted that from the Hidayah. Okay. Right? Right? Now there's a really beautiful quote, and this is why you leave blank space here, right? On the other page when you take notes. Of course, this is a reminder, like take notes, exclamation mark, right? Imam al-Kashmiri in Fayd al-Bari mentions, and I'll just translate it straight up. It's volume 1, page 8. That niyyah, intention before prayer or before wudu, is, as the fuqaha mentioned, is to know what prayer you're performing. Right? Likewise in wudu. So none of the Hanafis would say that if someone makes wudu, they didn't have that feeling within that they're performing wudu. Right? So he says, so niyyah is a matter of the heart, that لا مناص عنها في الأفعال الاختيارية, that is invariably present in any willful action. You chose to do it, meaning you intended it. The existence of choice entails that the basic intention, qasdu ta'a, that you resolved to do it. Why else are you doing it? Right? And he argues that, so the hadith, we understand it to refer not to making an intention. It's not some magical act. The intention is invariable, but rather the hadith, actions are but by their intentions, and each person shall only have what they intended. The primary purpose of that is to distinguish between corrupt intentions and good intentions, right? And high intentions, to intend Allah and His Messenger, sallallahu alaihi wasallam. Right? 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 And there's a good discussion there. It actually goes quite an extensive discussion at the early on in Fayd al-Bari, volume 1, page 8 to 10. Okay, and wiping the whole head once, because that's a general practice of the Prophet ﷺ. He's defined masaha ra'sahu, right? So mashu ra'sihi marratan ay mustaw'ibatan, right? Wiping one's head once, meaning completely. Wa mashu kulli ra'sihi marratan, yani wiping one's entire head once, meaning fully. The full head is from the past the top of the forehead till one's ears. Going beyond that is recommended. Again, one should not leave wiping the whole head unless one has some skin condition or something. The ruling of all the sunnahs. There's no specific way that's related, but what's understood from the sunnah is that one places both arms and both hands and fingers from the front of one's head. One places all one's fingers. أن يضع كفيه وأصابعه على مقدم الرأس ويمدها إلى القفا على وجه مستوعب, and you move them till the back of the head in a manner that wipes the entire area, right? And wiping the ears with the same wetness. The sunnah in our madhab is not to use fresh water for the ears. And the Maraqi indicates to the contrary, but that's a weak opinion. That if you take fresh water, it would be good. The madhab in our, is to use the same wetness. And Ibn Abdin made that very clear. And then one wipes the ears with the same wetness. وَمَسْحُ أُذُنَيْهِ بِمَائِهِ, and wiping the ears with the same wetness, meaning the wetness that of the head. And one of the wisdoms is the tips of your fingers have not been used for wiping, so there's no need to take fresh water. And wiping in our madhab is light. You don't wipe like it's a light act. And it's sunnah in our madhab with the same water they use for wiping the head. That's the sunnah, not with new water. Right? And taking fresh water is contrary to what's in the major, in the mutun and shuruh of the madhab. So it's one of the places where what is the detail mentioned by Shurun Bulali does not quite accord with the majority position. Rahmatullah alayhi. It's a really great work, but just note that. Right? And one does so with, one wipes, any wiping of the ear fulfills the sunnah. The recommendation is with the inside of the ears is done with the tips of one's index fingers, and the outer part of the ears would be, which is what we call the back of the ears, with the inside of one's thumbs, right? Ibn Abdin quoted that from al-Quhustani. And observing the prescribed order, right? Because that's how the wudu of the Prophet ﷺ is understood. And performing the actions consecutively, wila, and which is that you wash the next limb before the previous limb would have dried in normal conditions, unless there's an excuse. So a minor interruption doesn't affect the sunnah. It's recommended not to busy yourself with external actions during wudu, but minor interruption doesn't affect the sunnah. A major interruption, which is such that the last limb you washed would have dried in normal conditions before you moved on to the next one, a major interruption would make it sunnah to start again, unless there's an excuse, such as you got to get to work or something. The author did not mention one of the important sunnahs that is mentioned by in the Tanweer and the Durr, for example, or in Nur al-Idah and the Maraqi, which is number one, al-Dalq. And there's two sunnahs that the author did not mention. So note, one is al-Dalq, rubbing, and the majority opinion in the madhab is that it's a sunnah mu'akkada, right? Which is to rub the hand on a limb that is washed. And it's optimal to do it after the first washing, because that ensures completeness. And leaving wastefulness, the author of the Durr and others deemed it an emphasized sunnah. Wallahu a'lam. Then there are two actions that the author mentioned as being recommended. He says, وَمُسْتَحَبُّهُ التَّيَامُنْ وَمَسْحُ الرَّقَبَةِ. Its recommended acts are beginning with the right and wiping the ears. Right? So, and wiping the back, beginning with the right and just use this. Beginning with the right and wiping the neck, wiping the back of the neck. So beginning with the right. So a recommended act is what the Prophet ﷺ did sometimes and left sometimes, right? One is rewarded for doing it, and it's not blameworthy to leave. And beginning with the right applies to the hands and the feet. It applies to the hands and the feet, the arms and the feet. Others deem this to be a sunnah mu'akkada. There's some discussion in the Hanafi madhab about this. Others deem this to be a sunnah mu'akkada. Okay? Right? As you see in Shurbulali in the Maraqi, because the argument is that beginning with the right, did the Prophet ﷺ do it habitually or legislatively? So there's some discussion about that. But Imam Nasafi, is a giant, deemed it recommended. The caution is to treat it as if it's an emphasized sunnah. And wiping the back of the neck, right, which would be with wiping the back of the neck, you can in any way. But one of the ways they suggest is with the back of the hand, because it's still wet, right? Not the front of the neck, because that's a bid'ah. And the basis for wiping the back of the neck is that the Prophet ﷺ would sometimes extend the wiping of the head till his lower neck, his qafa, sallallahu alaihi wasallam. This is, wiping the neck is not actually mentioned explicitly in Zahir al-Riwayah, but it is, and so the ulama differed. The early scholars of the Hanafi madhab had three opinions on wiping the neck. Either that it is recommended or that it's an emphasized sunnah. Others said that it's not sunnah. That's why Imam Abu Hanifa and his companions didn't mention it. Most of the madhab settled on it being recommended. That's what Imam Nasafi chose. There are many other recommended acts in the wudu, and we'd encourage you to connect with those. And adab, they're mentioned in Nur al-Idah and its commentary. You can see it there, bi'idhnillahi ta'ala. So that's what we wanted to cover today. Next class, we're going to look at the actions that invalidate the wudu, and then move on from there to the ghusl. Just very briefly, a few of the key recommended acts of wudu are that in wiping the ears, one actually insert one's little finger in one's ear canal after wiping the ear. It's recommended. Making wudu before the time, unless one has a chronic excuse. Not speaking during wudu, or not busying oneself with other actions. Saying Bismillah before washing or wiping any limb. To engage in dua during wudu, and there's suggested du'as that are related from the early Muslims, but any du'as, those du'as ulama liked because they're very emphatic. But any du'as would do it, but there's a hikmah why the ulama recommended them. To send blessings upon the Prophet ﷺ after the wudu, and to make the dua after the wudu, Allahumma ja'alni min at-tawwabin wa ja'alni min al-mutatahhirin. Right? And to drink a little of the leftover water if you're making wudu from a container, facing the qibla. Right? Allahumma ja'alni min at-tawwabin wa ja'alni min al-mutatahhirin. And there's other du'as that one can say there as well. Right? From the adab of wudu are to pay attention to the difficult to reach places. Right? Because you assume the water reaches, which includes between your eye and your nose. To take care of your heels. Right? The back, above the back of your heel, right? The arch of your heel, the part that doesn't touch the ground. It's from the adab of wudu to extend both washing and wiping. Italatul ghurra wa tahjeel. It's recommended, right? Right? Italatul ghurra, extending the washing and wiping in all the places. Rubbing the legs with the left hand was deemed an adab. And then they say if the skin is dry, or in winter time, or when it's cold, or you have limited water, right? They say before you wash, take a wetted hand and rub the area. Right? It is mentioned by Imam al-Haskafi in the Dur. Ibn Abdin explains why. He says with water in a man, it's like applying oil. And the benefit of that is that you have to use less water. So if you have very limited water, you take a dripping wet hand and rub the area first, then you pour water, it'll go much easier. This also is useful if people have waswasa, etc. It's an adab. It's not sought in itself. It's an adab. And a neglected sunnah after wudu is to pray 2 rak'ahs. It's called sunnatul wudu. If you make wudu at any time other than a disliked time. And the sunnah can be fulfilled as long as you pray the 2 rak'ahs before your limbs would have normally dried, even if you dried them afterwards. And there's many other recommended acts, but these are some that are often neglected. So we could mention these. And then ثم قال الإمام النسفي رحمه الله وينقضه خروج نجس منه. The wudu is invalidated by the exiting of filth from the person. We'll take that next. وصلى الله على سيدنا ونبينا محمد وعلى آله وصحبه وحزبه. Any questions before we close? And I apologize for going slightly over the time. Any questions?
We were mentioned the three positions on the beard, the wulb, or the ghusl, and
Sorry. What are they?
The ghusl lihya, then wiping a quarter of the beard, and wiping the beard. So
Not in that order. The order, the optimal, the relied upon position is غسل اللحية في دائرة الوجه. Is to wash the beard within the limits of the face. يكفي غسل ظاهرها في الكثة ولا بد من إيصال الماء إلى باطنها في الخفيفة. Right? One must wash the outward part of the beard if it's thick, and the water must reach inside if it's thin. والخفيفة ما يرى بشرتها. The light beard is that which you can see the skin from a normal distance. And this within da'irat al-wajh. What is beyond the da'irat al-wajh is recommended to wipe. And the separate recommendation is the takhleel. Of course, it's mentioned by Mawlana Mullah Ali al-Qari in Sharh Ayn al-Ilm wa Zayn al-Hilm that it is from the Sunnah of the Prophet ﷺ to brush one's beard, to take care of one's hair in general, and that will include one's beard as well. Right? There's multiple hadiths about it. You can see it in Ayn al-Ilm wa Zayn al-Hilm here. So if you make wudu and your beard is disheveled, it's not a sunnah of wudu, but it's from the sunnah of the deen to fix it up. And there's of course many other adab, not getting water on oneself, etc. So what was the question?
So are all three of these sahih, followable positions such that if someone were to do, for example, wiping a quarter of the beard, would one have to do amr bil ma'ruf?
Nope. Firstly, don't look at people. Right? One of the last advices of Sidi bin Mashish to Sidi Abul Hasan al-Shadhili was, Ya Ali, Allah Allah, wa nas an-nas, nazzih lisanaka min dhikrihim, wa qalbaka an at-tamayuli min qibalihim. Right? That be mindful of Allah, remain mindful of Allah, and beware of people, Keep your tongue from mentioning them, and keep your heart from inclining towards them. And so don't look at other people, right? You have a doubt, have husn al-dhan and look away. Doesn't matter if they washed 1/10 of their face, you're not responsible for that. Right? But looking out of suspicion of somebody is suspicion of somebody. وَلَا تَجَسَّسُوا. Right? Don't spy on each other, right? And there's a spying, which is to pry into someone's private affairs. That is spying. But a lot of the Salaf were so careful that when they walked past someone's house, they would look down. Right? So that they wouldn't look at anything of their property, because it's none of my business. Sufyan al-Thawri was once walking with his students behind him, and he noticed that some of them were looking at some of the fancy houses. He said, lower your gazes, because it's only gazes like these that result in the building of things like this. Right? Certainly the washing the beard, of course, is there, but wiping the whole beard is a strong opinion. The quarter of the beard does exist, but then they differed. Right? But there is leeway there, especially for qada and stuff. But we don't teach that in a general class, right? Just tell people how to do the right thing. Right? But of course, you can't just hear about opinions. You can't just throw them around like they're candy being distributed in a majlis. Go ahead.
Someone was asking, do we have to memorize the ruling of the text?
Have to memorize the rulings of the text? No. But they say, "Man hafiza hujjatun ala man lam yahfaz." The one who memorizes is a proof against those who don't. But those who work harder are proof against those who don't, right? And it helps, right? That a key text like the Kanz, for example, right? When in this tahaddusan bin ni'mah, when Shaykh Abdul Razak al-Halabi was teaching Kashf al-Haqa'iq, wrote out the Kanz with notes from Kashf al-Haqa'iq and a few notes here and there just to clarify the text. I don't know where that copy is. But then later, also wrote out, I have a couple of volumes of notes on the, and if you guys are not, we might just photocopy these. So, who knows, someone pious might actually write out the notes, but that's a big exercise. But certainly we can make a PDF of these notes. They're not bad. They could be of some use. We'll give them on the thing that these are not for distribution, because they're certainly not final, but they're pretty good. They're quite precise, bismillah. So we mentioned in the previous class write out the text, write out your notes. If you know Arabic, the things that are referred to, you could find them in, and we mentioned where you can find the notes, etc. We only touched on the legal reasoning a little bit, but we touched upon that in the previous class. You can review the notes on that. Bi-idhnillahi ta'ala. Any other questions?
Someone is asking, what's the recommended sharh or hashia? They are unable to find the sharh of Allama Qasim on the Mukhtasar al-Manar.
Sharh. Okay, in the inshallah we let's make sure this week bi'idhnillahi ta'ala we'll have the courses open and we'll add the students to them bi'idhnillah. So if you share your email right there, we'll send it to you right after this session. It's available, right? It's available in PDF and it's available for purchase as well. It's called Khulasatul Afkar, Sharh Mukhtasar al-Manar. Just don't get the Dar ibn Hazm edition and you're pretty fine. And nothing personal against the editor of the Dar ibn Hazm edition, but he's an anti-Hanafi who edits Hanafi books. So it's a bit frustrating for a student of knowledge. Right.
I'd like to ask about the first line of legal reasoning on the taqdir of the ruba', if that's within the scope.
What's the first line?
The first line of legal reasoning given was that the kitab is mujmal and that the
No. So the first line of legal reasoning formally is the other one. Right?
So in the secondary line of legal reasoning then,
Good.
Where the kitab is mujmal and the hadith of Mughira clarifies it, and that hadith,
And many other hadiths.
What's mentioned in that hadith is that the Prophet wiped his lihya, not ruba'. So how did these scholars take, again, according to this line of reasoning?
No, that's about the head.
Yes.
Forget the lihya. The lihya is a separate issue.
Oh, sorry, I meant the nasiya. The wiping of the nasiya is what's mentioned in the hadith.
Okay.
So how did the scholars go from the nasiya to giving, you could say, taqdir to the nasiya?
Okay, so the nasiya itself refers to the front part of the head. The nasiya itself is less than a quarter. So how do they get the quarter? Because the nasiya, and if you do mash, which is imrarul yad, the least motion would get you to the quarter of the head. Just visualize or imagine the midpoint of your head, put your finger on it, put your hand on the tip of your head, right? Move, just slight movement, you get to the half of the head. Nobody's suggesting running scientific experiments on your head. Because masaha nasiyatahu, the nasiya literally is the front part of your head. It's your forelock or whatever, is where you would grab, it's like, where you could grab the front of the head, right? So technically, some said the nasiya is the ruba', but technically, in the usage of the Arabs, etc., the forelock or whatever it's called, the front of your head is less than a quarter, but with slight movement, it hits a quarter. And there's half a dozen opinions on this.
question related to Tahara. Does the harf of Illah imply inclusivity generally?
The issue of Illah is a lengthy discussion, right? The ulama, many of the ulama distinguish between ghayatu imtidad and ghayatu isqat. There's an Illah when it's used to extend something, right? So you have a concept and you stretch it with Illah, then then it takes one set of rulings. And there's ghayat isqat, when the Illah cuts off what is after that, and that takes one set of rulings. And it's discussed, I think, in Tahtawi, on the Maraqi, etc. For those who'd like to read it. But in al-Bahr al-Ra'iq, Ibn Nujaym doesn't like the whole discussion. He says there's no ultimate benefit in this discussion insofar as there's ijma'. He argues that the elbows enter. The elbows and heels enter. Although there'd be argument with him about that, because the opinion of Zufar would affect that ijma'. Right? Wallahu a'lam.
There's a question regarding wiping the head. You mentioned the head is that which is above the ears. Does this mean that you cannot wipe the back of your head for a sister washing in public, wiping the back of her head under her hijab?
Back of the head, above the ears or below? Because below the ears, nobody said, did you wipe your head? No. Like someone did this. They say, I wiped my head. No, you wiped your neck. The neck is not the head. So above the ears, above the top of the ears is head, below the top of the ears is neck.
Does something being blameworthy mean is not written as a sin?
Yeah, blameworthy. Isa'a is فوق الكراهة التنزيهية ودون الكراهة التحريمية. Something there being isa'a, blameworthiness, it's above being somewhat disliked. Right? So it's makruh, it's somewhat disliked plus blameworthiness. If you keep accruing this blameworthiness, this accruing could reach the level of being sinful.
One final question from YouTube. What should someone do if they are making wudu and before completing it they are interrupted such that the limbs are dry? Will it be necessary when they make wudu again to wash the parts washed before, or can they?
No. So observing. So what if one had a major interruption, right? What's the ruling of leaving a sunnah? Sunnah mu'akkada. What's the ruling of leaving a sunnah mu'akkada?
Left habitually could be sinful.
Yeah, so firstly, it does not affect validity. Without excuse, so it's not sinful, right? Leaving it is somewhat disliked and blameworthy if left without excuse. If made a habit, it could be made a habit without excuse, it could be sinful. Because someone could be in a situation where they're working high security, they lost their wudu, so they're allowed to take a tiny break. So they make a minimum wudu, minimum prayer, and they gave them permission to do that. Khalas, you have an excuse, even if it happens daily for that prayer. You try to adjust things so you don't, but there may be exceptional circumstances where you may have to. So if it's left, if there's an excessive interruption, if there's no excuse, it will be sunnah to restart. It will be sunnah to restart the wudu. But there may be situations where you can't. let's say it's really cold and you have a foot condition that's very sensitive. So you made wudu at home and you just wash your feet at work. And you don't get enough time, so you started wudu at 7:30 a.m. but you're going to miss the bus. So you headed to work. When you got to work, you only have a 5-minute break, so you just washed your feet to be able to do your sunnah comfortably, your fard prayer comfortably. In itself, it would have been better to do the full wudu, but let's say you don't have the opportunity. So we shouldn't learn how to be slackers, but this empowers us. We can, and there's some of the Sahaba, if the ground was wet, they would make wudu at home and just wash their feet near the masjid, or so it's related. ربنا تقبل منا إنك أنت السميع العليم وتب علينا إنك أنت التواب الرحيم وصلي وسلم وبارك على الرحمة المهداة والنعمة المسداة سيدنا ونبينا محمد المصطفى وآله وصحبه نجوم الهدى وسلم تسليما كثيرا سبحان ربك رب العزة عما يصفون وسلام على المرسلين والحمد لله رب العالمين.
Of the water intentionally, how did the Ahnaf substantiate this in view of its necessity in the other schools?
We do have to. Does the mujtahid has to justify their understanding to somebody else? No, right? Number one, it's simple, right? Like, and that's sometimes like you just gotta simplify, right? Like someone, this is what they understood to be. You don't have to prove yourself to somebody else necessarily, number one. But, right, the Hanafis distinguish between the decisive and the non-decisive. So the burden of evidence is on others. Where is the proof that the intention is obligatory? Number one, obligatory in wudu. So the burden of proof is on the claimant. You are claiming that it's obligatory. Where is your proof? Number one. Number two, the indication of the Hanafis distinguish between the decisive and the non-decisive. What the indication of the ayah of Tahara is, if you stand to pray, then do this. The muqtada nas is, if you do this, then you can pray. Right? Right? If you do 4 actions, you can pray. They say, الزيادة على النص نسخ لمدلولها. Adding to a decisive text is a type of abrogation of its indication. The verse indicates, if you do these 4 actions, you can now pray. Where there's no indication in the verse of niyyah. Right? And then it's tahara. Water purifies. You make tahara with water, and أنزل عليكم من السماء ماء ليطهركم به, to purify with you. Water purifies. What we've been commanded to use water for tahara. Right? Wudu refers to غسل الأعضاء, washing the limbs. If the limb got washed, wudu happened. Right? It's a condition. It just has to be fulfilled, just like any other condition. Right? Also because inconceivable that someone does wudu without intending it, except in this case of Sister Sa'daniyah who fell asleep on the park bench or whatever. Right? And that's, the back and forth with the other madhab, so that's studied post Kanz and so on. But these are just some of the indicators. For those of you who have some more exposure, if you look in Kashf al-Haqa'iq, Sharh Kanz al-Daqa'iq, which also is one of the resources for the course, it may be advanced for some, but some may be able to access this. The core arguments are found there. We welcome them after class, etc. Inshallah, and we're at your service. وصلى الله على سيدنا محمد وعلى آله وصحبه وسلم. But these are good questions. جزاكم الله تعالى خيرا. يعني the teacher and the student are شركاء في الخير. So these are good questions. I thank you for them. Assalamu alaikum.